Hey everyone, and welcome back to another art video. I hope you're having an amazing day, and thanks so much for joining me on this one. In today's tutorial, I'm going to be taking you through 3 super powerful watercolor exercises for beginners. These exercises or drills will all help you continue developing 2 must-have skills when painting with watercolor, which are water control and brush control. But aside from practicing your water and your brush control, these 3 exercises that I have planned for this video challenge you in different ways. Now, even though in my opinion, these are essential watercolor exercises that every beginner should practice, they are awesome practice even for more experienced watercolor artists, as they are all a great way to stay consistent, even in those days when you're super busy or super tired and you don't have much time or ability to focus on a more difficult watercolor project. So with all this said, let's go ahead and have some fun and practice our watercolor together. Alright, so I'm going to be using some cold pressed watercolor paper. This is student grade and it's not the best paper. It's from Hanemule. I like having some less expensive watercolor paper in my studio for this kind of practice work. But I've divided one of these sheets into 3 parts. Feel free to separate out your watercolor sheet using a ruler, the way that I did, or fill up entire sheets with each one of these drills, whatever you feel is best for you. But you definitely do want to have enough space for each exercise because otherwise you might not get the most from it. Alright, so I've titled our first exercise Irregular Lines. With this first exercise, we're going to be practicing creating nice juicy puddles of color on our color mixing palette in order to properly load up our paintbrush bristles with a good amount of paint and water so that we're able to start and finish our irregular lines via one single stroke without having to lift our paintbrush off the page. With this exercise, we're also practicing varying the pressure that we're exerting on our paintbrush in order to create these very irregular lines, or I would even see these more as shapes, abstract, elongated shapes more than lines. And the way that we create these irregular shapes is through shifting and changing the pressure that we're exerting as we are laying down that stroke. So at some points, just the tip of your paintbrush is going to be coming into contact with the paper when you want that line to be thinner or that shape to be more narrow. And when you want that shape to be wider, you're going to be pressing down your paintbrush bristles a little bit more onto the paper so that the entire belly of the brush is creating a wider shape. Try not lifting the paintbrush entirely off of the page as you move from start to finish. I've titled our second exercise Triangles. And with this exercise, we're painting shapes. And because we're actually filling in a shape, we're essentially creating washes. These triangles are going to be varying in size. So in some cases, those washes are going to be much smaller. And in other cases, they're going to be much larger. But this exercise is powerful because it's going to challenge us to paint quicker because we're painting on dry paper, and dry paper dries very quickly when you're working with watercolor. And if you have any experience painting with this medium, then you probably already know how easy it can be to arrive at lines and undesired textures because the paint starts to dry way too quickly. And so it's essential that we learn how to load up our paintbrush bristles effectively, and also when we're doing reloading, that we come back to pick up that edge or that bead where we left off so that we can continue filling in that shape quickly. With this exercise, I also want to encourage you to practice blooms. A bloom is created when you drop in another color on paint that is still wet. I'm going to be providing tips and tricks for success with all of these as we move forward in the video, and I'll be explaining what I like to personally do in order to keep that first layer wetter for longer so that I can then drop in another color and have that second color expand into that first color and create nice soft transitions and a soft effect, a wet on wet effect, if you will. All right, and moving on to exercise number 3, and this one is great because it challenges you to rotate your hand and arm in different directions. And we're gonna do this via painting curves. What's challenging about drawing or painting curves is that you have to visualize that path that is going to create that curve or that circle. And this also requires us to shift and change directions as we're painting and rotating our hand and wrists in different ways. So this will definitely help us build that muscle memory. And for that last exercise, I'm really going to be pushing myself to not only paint in those strokes in one direction, but I push myself to go in the opposite direction as well. And this is again in order to develop that muscle memory that is going to help me more easily shift and change the way that I am using my paintbrush when I'm actually creating a full painting. Because really, when we're creating watercolor paintings, we don't only use the paintbrush in one single way, one single position, one single angle. We're constantly changing the way that we're using our painting tools as we go in order to fill in smaller areas or larger areas or to create textures, etc. All right, so now that you know the importance of these exercises and our objectives with each, let's go ahead and get started with preparing our paint mixtures. I'm going to be using a size 10 round brush for all of these exercises, just one single brush, and honestly I would recommend you do the same. Pick just one single brush to work with, make it a medium-sized brush. I would say anything between an 8 to a 12 would do great, and challenge yourself to use just one single brush. I'm going to be using my Daniel Smith paint palette. I'll share exactly which colors I am using on screen, but you can use whichever colors you like for these exercises. Whatever colors you choose though, make sure that you spend enough time creating your color mixtures and that the consistency of these color mixtures is going to be helpful for you along the way. And what I mean by this is you want to make sure that your puddles are nice and juicy, somewhere between a coffee to milk-like consistency, I would say, would be very helpful. So maybe 50% water, 50% paint. You want a good amount of pigmentation in your puddles, but also some amount of water movement, because again, you want to be able to effectively load up your paintbrush, and you're not going to be able to load up a good amount of paint and water in your paintbrush bristles if you have very dry color mixtures that have a very small amount of water in them. However, if you want your color to appear nice and bright and saturated, make sure that there is a good amount of color in them as well. Otherwise, if they are super watery and they have a small amount of pigment in them, that is more of what is referred to as a tea-like consistency, and the color is going to appear very pale, very watered down. I continue bringing out a little bit of water at a time from my container onto my palette. Notice how much water movement I have here on my palette, but how much color is in that mixture as well. That's what you want, so that you're able to properly load up your paintbrush before going in. Even though my puddles start merging together in some cases, and throughout the process I'm altering colors by bringing in a little bit more of this color or that color to create variations of those colors, I am keeping my warmer colors separate from my cooler colors. This way I can make sure that no complementary colors are going to start intermixing. Complementary colors will mute each other out, or you can even start creating browns if you mix complementaries together. So if you want to keep your colors bright, you might want to give thought to keeping your reds, oranges, and yellows separate from your blues, purples, and greens. Another thing that I would suggest if you want to keep your colors bright and clean is making sure that you're effectively rinsing out your paintbrush bristles in between your colors, and that you're changing your water whenever you see it becoming murky. Inversely to that, if you're into muted down colors, which can certainly be beautiful as well, there are many ways that you can mute down your colors. So one of these ways can be bringing in a little bit of neutral tint or Payne's gray into your color mixtures. Just a bit goes a long way. Or even bringing in a brown into your color mixtures, or a tiny bit of its complementary. All of those are ways that you can mute down colors. Let's get started with our first exercise, the irregular lines. So I loaded up my paintbrush bristles with a good amount of that reddish color that I prepared for myself on my color mixing palette. And I went right in and started working from left to right. If you're left-handed, you can certainly go from right to left. It's totally up to you. Or you can even alternate between the two. In the first one, work from left to right, then work from right to left, then again from left to right, and so on and so forth. So as I mentioned in the beginning of this video, one of the challenges for this irregular line exercise is to create that elongated shape with one single stroke, trying to always have at least some amount of those paintbrush bristles in contact with your paper or touching the paper. If you find that midway through you start running out of paint, then you probably haven't loaded up your paintbrush enough with a good amount of paint and water. So make sure that the consistency of your paint is what you need it to be, and make sure that you're taking enough before getting started. Another thing is make sure that you're not using a paintbrush that is way too small, because if you're using a very small detailing brush, for example, well, the smaller the brush, the less amount of paint you're going to be able to load up in those bristles, right? So all of these things could be factors that are making the process of creating one single stroke more difficult for you. So check on those things if you're having trouble. And as you're moving towards one direction or another, you want to alter how much pressure you're exerting on your paintbrush. So at times, lift up your paintbrush just a tiny bit more so that just the tip of your paintbrush is coming into contact with the paper, versus other times you want to be pressing down to different degrees in order to widen that shape. There is no specific pattern that I'm trying to create for these irregular lines. I'm just having fun with it and letting go. And then as I make my way down, I change colors, making sure that I've removed all of the previous color from my paintbrush bristles. I load up my paintbrush with the next color and continue creating those brush strokes, trying to leave a sliver of white paper in between my long shapes, and also noticing the curves that I've created with the previous line and using that to inform how I use my paintbrush with the one underneath it. All right, moving into exercise number 2, the triangles exercise. I made sure to change my water after having finished with the last exercise. And with this one, we're going to be practicing a few different things. First and foremost, we're practicing filling in a shape as quickly as possible so that we're not left with lines and undesired textures throughout that shape. Remember that when we're painting wet on dry, like we're doing right now, that paint starts getting absorbed into the paper and starts drying immediately. And if your paint dries, you're going to be left with sharp, defined edges around that last shape or stroke that you painted in. And so this is going to lead to having edges or lines inside of your triangle. So as you're making your way down or towards the side and you're filling in that shape, keep it moving. And if your paintbrush starts running out of paint and you need to reload, do that quickly and come back to pick up exactly where you left off before that edge starts drying on you. Make sure that as you're creating all of these triangles, that you're making some of these larger and some of these smaller. Create a variety of triangles here. This way you can practice filling in larger shapes and smaller shapes. They both have their different challenges. Another thing that we're trying to practice with this exercise is creating blooms. So once you have succeeded at filling in that triangle with color, drop in a second color on top of that first layer while it's still wet. And if that initial layer is still wet, when you drop in that second color is going to expand into that wetness and create a nice soft gradient or bloom. If your initial layer starts drying, then that bloom is not going to happen. And it is important that you know that the environment that you're working in is going to have a huge impact on how quickly or how slowly that paint starts drying on you. And yes, of course, the type of paper and the quality of paper that you're using certainly does have an impact on how quickly that paint gets absorbed into that paper and how the paint sits on it and just moves around on it. However, the environment that you're working in also has an impact on how your painting process goes, especially when working with watercolor. If you're working in a warm environment, a cool environment, a dry environment, a humid environment, if you have a fan on, if you have a heating system on, an air conditioning unit on, all of those things have an impact on how quickly or how slowly your paint dries. I can tell you for myself, I live in a very warm and usually dry environment, and something that helps me keep my initial layer wetter for longer so that I can then drop in more color and have nice diffused out soft wet on wet effects is I make sure to spend a little bit longer when I am painting in that initial layer. So all I do is run my paintbrush bristles over that entire area or shape that I want to keep wet longer, 3 to 5 times very gently. And then while that initial layer is still wet, I go ahead and drop in my next color or whatever it is that I'm going to be doing. But an essential skill that we also have to learn when we're getting started with watercolor is noticing when our paper is starting to dry. Because the moment that that paint starts to dry, you shouldn't be doing any more work at all. That is going to probably lead to splotchiness, backruns, and undesired effects. So continue paying attention to how wet your paper is. If you see a nice even sheen all throughout the triangle, you can go in and continue dropping in more color to create blooms or to gently move that paint around that you've placed on paper, or perhaps to soften little textures that you've created accidentally. But if certain sections start to dry, or you find that it's in an awkward semi-dry state, you probably shouldn't be doing much at all. Just allow it to dry completely and move on to your next triangle. I'm also making sure that when I am dropping in a second color on top of a previous color, that I am going with analogous colors, meaning colors that are next to each other in the color wheel. I'm not dropping in a green onto a red, or a green onto an orange, or a blue onto an orange, because I know that that can create muddiness or undesired colors that I don't want right now. And I'm also making sure that I'm dropping in that color and just allowing the paint to do its own thing. Hold yourself back from going in and doing unnecessary blending and moving around of your paint. This is going to help you in your watercolor journey so much, because it is so easy to start overworking our artwork. And one last thing that I'm also practicing throughout this process, and I've done it a couple of times by this point, is I am practicing lifting. Lifting is a very important technique when it comes to painting with watercolor that you should definitely know about, because it'll help you correct mistakes, make mistakes less noticeable. With lifting, you can use either the clean and slightly damp bristles of your paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge to go in and pick up excess color or water. And you can also, of course, do lifting with your absorbent towel. Just going in with your absorbent towel, absorbing that excess color or water, and doing whatever you have to do. And I do this a couple of times when I see that that color looks a little bit too flat. Maybe I was a little bit too heavy-handed with color that was too dark or saturated, and I wanted to add in a little bit of dimension into that flat wash. I remove that color from my paintbrush bristles, remove the excess water by dabbing the tip of my paintbrush on my absorbent towel, and I go back in and lift up some of that color off the page. This reveals a little bit more of that paper under that color and creates a little bit of a variety in value or translucency throughout that shape, giving that shape more dimension. Even though when working with watercolor, it's highly unlikely that you'll be able to go back to the whiteness and the brightness the paper once had before you place color on it, lifting is an essential technique to know, because it'll help you stay on top of water control as you're painting, and it'll help you correct mistakes or at least make them less noticeable. No matter what kind of painting it is that I am working on, lifting is a technique that I almost always bring in. All right, let's get into our third and last exercise. This is the one with the curves. So once again, I changed my water to make sure that I was starting out with a nice clean container of water. And you may want to create a couple of lines for yourself in this area so that we can create a few different rows for this pattern and things don't get too crooked. Hopefully you can see how I've created a couple of pencil lines right here before getting started. And I just used a ruler so that those lines could be nice and straight. And you might want to create more lines if you have more space that you're working in. But once I had my 2 lines in, I loaded up my brush with a good amount of paint and I just went ahead and got started with my first row. And in that first row, I'm making my way from left to right. And I believe with the second one, I work from right to left. And then in the third one, I once again switched to working from left to right. But instead of painting my curves starting at the left and making my way towards the right, I start my curves in the upper right tip and make my way towards the left. Really, it's all about challenging yourself to go in different directions in every sense of the word. So these strokes that I'm creating right here are very similar to the C strokes that I explained in a past tutorial video that I shared several months back. I'll make sure to leave a link to that video, which is an essential brushstroke drills for beginners video, down below in the text section of this post in case you'd like to go and check it out. And with the second row, as I said, now I'm going from right to left, and I'm also flipping that U or that smile upside down. And you can see how working in this direction is really not natural for me. I had to go in and fix that second one a little bit, but these are definitely not as good as the first row. And that's okay. That's a good thing that you're discovering what comes easier and what's more of a challenge for you, because this way you know what you have to work on a little bit more. And it really is just a matter of practice and consistency. I'm really paying attention to how I'm rotating my wrist and moving my forearm as I'm creating that brush stroke. You can start slowly, and then you're going to notice that as you become more comfortable, you become quicker and quicker. All right, so I'm now getting to work on the third row, and I'm working from left to right again, but you can see how I'm starting the stroke on the right side and I'm making my way towards the left. So as opposed to what I did in the first one, the tail end of these strokes is on the left. And I notice that this is definitely not comfortable for me either, but I just keep pushing through and doing the best that I can. We're not going for perfection here. This is just some fun practice work. All right, so now that these initial strokes are in and they've all pretty much dried at this point, I'm going to finish up this pattern by adding in a second color inside of each U. So this is similar to a semicircle shape, but it's really going to depend on how wide or tall you made your U's. Whatever that initial stroke looks like, it doesn't matter, just try to fill it in with a similar shape to mine. And try to leave a little sliver or section of white paper in between your initial stroke and this new shape that you're filling it in with. Creating C strokes or this type of curved stroke may look easy, but it is challenging and it takes time and practice. So don't get frustrated and keep practicing. You'll become better at them. So depending on your level and how you're feeling, you might want to spend a little bit longer just making rows in the direction that comes more naturally to you. So for me, for example, it would be the direction that I created the first row in, and spend a little bit longer creating those. And then once you're a little bit more comfortable, you can challenge yourself to go in other directions. Drawing and painting curves is hard because it requires you shifting and changing the direction of that stroke as you go, as you visualize that path that you need to run through to create that curve. So it's not easy. Give yourself time and have patience while you continue practicing. Did you enjoy this tutorial? I really hope you did, and if so, make sure to check out everything that I'm offering over at my Patreon membership website, because for a very small amount a month, you're going to get immediate access to my exclusive tutorials, classes, and resources that I don't share anywhere else. All of these exclusive tutorials include my downloadable outline sketches so that you don't have to start from scratch, reference photos, and my supply lists. There's already a library of over 75 sketching and watercolor painting tutorials that are real-time, meaning they are not sped up or edited, they are fully narrated, and I take you through my entire process, making sure to explain everything as clearly as possible, step by step. 2 new exclusive full-length tutorials are added into this exclusive library every single month. For those of you who are interested in really taking your artwork to the next level and want to know all of the inside secrets that I learned about in art school and courses that I've invested in myself, there's also a full library on classes on art fundamentals in which all of the bases are covered. That library has now over 35 classes and workshops, all have assignments at the end that help you actually put your knowledge to the test. And there's a brand new class or workshop added at the beginning of every single month. As if all of this weren't enough, you also get a weekly sketchbook prompt sent to your inbox to help you stay consistent with your art practice. There's a live training, workshop, or paint-along session with me every single month. Members in the $15 tier and upwards get access to thorough feedback from me on their work whenever they need it, and much more. There are different tiers that you can join that give you access to different things, which you can choose from depending on your goals and needs. So go ahead and check it out. I'm going to make sure to leave a link where you can find out more down below in the description box of this video. And I would love to get to know more about you and your work and have you join this innermost art community of mine. All right, you guys, that is gonna do it for today's video. I really hope that you enjoyed it and that you found it helpful. And if you did, pretty please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, because it really helps support the work that I am doing here on YouTube and helps others get to know about my channel. Thank you so much for watching today. Don't forget to subscribe and click on that little bell so that you can be notified of when I share my new videos, which happens every single week. Have a beautiful rest of the day and see you soon. Bye guys.